All right, so there's two more films to talk about. They're somewhat related, so I'll let you guys talk about Doubleplay first.
Okay. Jason, you want to start? Do you want me to start?
Yeah, Doubleplay, essentially the story of two filmmakers kind of coming together, not necessarily on purpose, I guess, but also on purpose, I think. We sort of follow the story of James Benning and Richard Linklater, who have sort of not necessarily collaborated over the years, but have sort of had this friendship and this relationship kind of back and forth. It's set, I guess, in the Austin area. Of course, Linklater's sort of settled himself into the Austin scene. And so for those of you that may not be aware of who James Benning is, I guess you would call him a documentarian of sorts, sort of
experimental
filmmaker.
Yeah,
to where he, sort of goes out into usually nature or sort of places where you wouldn't necessarily spend a lot of time necessarily showing that on film, but just sort of goes out and does sort of long exposure shots of random things, if it be a lake or a highway that has no traffic whatsoever on it, or the outside of a prison that he shouldn't be filming, and stuff like that. And basically, short films that are challenging in their own way, because you're kind of staring at this thing for a long time, and you're kind of asking yourself, what's the point of this? And there is a point, there becomes a point, whether or not you come up with that yourself or the filmmaker himself explains it to you. But you kind of get sort of that in between, from his career and Linklater's career, and sort of how they came together at I guess it was an interview session.
Yeah, so Richard Linklater is a curator as well, so he was, I think, instrumental in helping start the Austin Film Society.
Yeah.
And I believe that James Benning was their first filmmaker guest that they brought in. So their relationship, grew out of that, I believe. Yeah. And another thread in the film, I think there are two threads. The filmmaker named Gabe Klinger uses a thread of baseball to tie the two together. So they both were big fans of baseball, both loved baseball, and even Richard Linklater played baseball in college for a certain amount of time. And so they both have a link to baseball. Yeah. So that kind of ties things together, and even throughout the documentary where they're together on screen, sometimes they're playing catch or they're doing other things with baseball. So that's a thread. But then the other thread, I think, is time.
Sure.
So talking about how they play with time in their films. And so Benning, it's very obvious because of these extremely long takes.
Right.
But then a lot of the conversation came out of Boyhood as well, which is a film that we're going to talk about here. But Linklater's experiment of filming a film over 10 or 12 or 14 years. So I think those are some of the common threads. The documentary, the idea for the documentary, I guess, came from a documentary series about filmmakers that was started in the 60s by a Frenchman, and I don't remember his name. But it's a series of films that take portraits of filmmakers over the course of many years. And Gabe Klinger, the filmmaker, pitched this idea to the Frenchman who has kind of let this series last, as he wanted to reinvent the series with Linklater and Benning, and so he got the approval and funding to do this. I think it's an interesting take, especially we saw the film the same day that we saw Boyhood, or the next day, and so it was really great. I think a great tie-in to that, but it's also, I think, a great look at two extremely different worlds of filmmaking. One being very experimental, the other being independent and semi-commercial, and how there are some commonalities between the two of them. So I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I definitely thought it was more entertaining than I expected it to be. I thought Gabe did a great job at sort of going back and forth between the two.
Sure.
Really focusing, I think, really well on helping me personally understand what Benning's trying to do with his films.
Right.
And I had seen a lot of his stuff beforehand and found it challenging and really not my cup of tea. But after sort of seeing the film, made me want to go back and maybe look at some of that stuff, because it is done on purpose,
Right.
And to kind of see where I am in my filmmaking viewing career.
Yeah.
To sort of see if I'm just as challenged as I had been, because I was very young when I was sort of faced with watching some of his stuff.
Yep.
Mostly for just sort of like composition and things like that. So a really I really, really enjoyed it. I thought it did a good job at sort of having an open conversation, but not at the same time. Like, there are definitely conversations they have in the film, but
Right.
their film content also sort of has a conversation. I thought was, a pretty interesting way of going about it.
Yeah, yeah. And then the filmmaker, Gabe Klinger, also mimics in some ways Benning's style, at least in some of the shots, which
Sure.
is interesting as well. So, yeah, it was good. I would recommend it. The film actually won the Silver Lion at the Venice Film Festival this past year.
Yeah. Excellent. All right.
It would be great to bring to the IU Cinema with Gabe Klinger, James Benning, and Richard Linklater.
Yes, it would.
There you
So
go.
maybe that's a goal.
There you go.
Yeah.
A Place for Film is recorded at WFIU Studios in Bloomington, Indiana.